Four funeral homes in the state of Michigan, in Detroit, got nailed for improperly or illegally disposing of
Yep.
bodies. Most horribly, the bodies of newborn babies and or fetuses,
Yep.
stillborn or not born. And the first thing you read it when you think about this, when I thought of this is just disgusting.
Well,
I
and
mean, you
it's yeah, there were four separate individual funeral homes, but they had some
right.
similarities. The fetuses, the infants were one, but there were
Mm-hmm.
also, I mean, actual remains. I think only one had bodies. I may be wrong, but the four were Perry,
Mm-hmm.
Howell,
Yep.
Howell Ramsey,
Cantrell.
and Cantrell. Cantrell, by far of the four, was just far and away
Oh,
the worst.
you read the paperwork and it's like this
Yeah.
is disgusting. The state did like a 60-page report on it, and to flip through it, you see just it's
Yeah.
ghastly what went on. I
So
mean, it was first. Go ahead.
no, I was going to say. So what we should probably do before we start talking about the actual funeral homes is kind of lay some groundwork for, answer questions like, why is the funeral home have fetuses in it?
Right.
There was some embezzlement. How was that made possible?
Right.
Why Cantrell had 12 funeral directors unconnected to or just from
Right.
to
Just
so
rotating through the place one after the other.
so real quickly, just because of the work that I do with homeless and Title 19 applications and that kind of thing, I happen to have some background in dealing with this. And I think to begin with regard to the fetuses and
Mm-hmm.
stillborn, when there is a death and there are remains, there's only two things that can happen. If there's criminal involvement or something or a law and they need to investigate what happened, then the remains go to the coroner. Otherwise, the remains need to go to a funeral home. The average individual person is not legally allowed to handle remains. The remains can either go to a coroner or they can go to the funeral home. No one else is legally
Mm-hmm.
allowed to handle remains. But you have a case where you have a 27-minute, well, this poor child is born and dies. It still has to go to a funeral home. The remains, and I think actually I mentioned, I think is it Illinois that actually it's now a law, a state law, that if you
Mm-hmm.
have an abortion, you actually have to have a funeral for the remains. It's not required. I don't know
Yeah.
how that's going to stand up, what's going to happen with that. But again, that's kind of the commitment we have to the remains for someone. So in the case of the 21-minute old infant, the family had actually donated that child to
Right.
science. It's what they
To
wanted to
science.
happen. And I think
Yeah. It
that's
was. It.
I was
Go
going to
ahead.
say, I think it happens with the fetuses as well. Is that again, remains have to go to one way or the other. They go to the funeral home, and then from the funeral home, they can then be disseminated out to whatever medical school or laboratory or whoever's going to get those remains facilitated by the funeral home. So that's just to explain why they were there. With a funeral contract, the first amount set by state statute with regard to
Mm-hmm.
Medicaid is irrevocable. Whatever I put into that
Right.
fund, I'm not getting that money back. That's absolutely going to pay for the funeral. And that's to protect the state interest, because if there is no funeral contract, the state will pay for the cremation. And this is very important when we're going to get into what happened. So
Right.
that's the first part. So if I turn around and put $6,000 into a funeral contract, that's irrevocable money. The client's not getting that back. No one's getting that back. That $6,000 is going to sit there and help to pay for the funeral cost. And after that's revocable. So if I can put $20,000 into a funeral cost, the first, say for instance, $8,000 is irrevocable. I can get that $12,000 back if I want to. But again, the goal is to pay for the funeral and funeral costs of the client. What they were doing is this: they would get a check, and the check is always made out to the funeral home. What should have happened is a contract was drawn up covering the expenses, whatever that check was, or it may be in excess. They may draw up a $6,000 contract. You pay $4,000 towards it. You owe another $2,000. It's just an understanding of what the funeral is going to cost and how much you pay towards it. But the check is made out to the funeral home. The funeral home is supposed to then turn around and deposit whatever the state fund is, or whoever controls that fund. What they did was not deposit that check. They took it and cashed it. Now they're gambling. And the gamble is, one, they would be the funeral home that was going to take care of the remains so they could take care of it. And two, that no one was going to know, no one else outside of it was never going to know that the funeral contract had ever been contracted for. So when you say they located 18,000, that tells me that they had some paperwork on some of these that was completed and signed, but the checks were then deposited and never forwarded to the account. What that says to me is there's a ton of them that they just didn't do the paperwork on. Someone wrote them a check and they just cashed the check. So, it's all about what you can prove, and what you can prove is with the paper trail.
Right.
So now the flip to this is, the state does pay. Again, Connecticut, I'm used to. Connecticut's, I think, paying $1,400 at this point to cremate and it remains. It's cremation fee plus. So, and the funeral home does make money on that. And what I would be curious about, I didn't dig into too deep, but I'm willing to bet is they get $1,400 for each set of remains. So if you have a fetus or an infant that comes in, you're going to get $1,400 for that infant. If they're not being ethical, you can load a number of fetuses or infants in and do one cremation. The remains are mixed, but if they're unethical, they don't care anyway. So it's the cost of one cremation, but you get paid 20 times,
4 or 5 times.
No, you get a lot more than that.
It sounds like a classic middleman scheme where both ends. Both of the opposite ends are expecting the guy in the middle to act ethically, and because he doesn't,
without question,
both sides end up both of the outside parties get ripped off.
Culturally, we really trust our funeral. That's why this story is so shocking, because we really trust that they're going to do the right thing. I mean, when you think about it culturally, when someone passes, we treat that individual. We won't say negative things about someone after they died that we may have said to their face, before.
Yeah.
So this is such a cultural shock. So we have, kind of that issue, and then not to defend the funeral home, but they do get remains in, and they do have funerals, and then we'll be sitting waiting for payment, and it's they're not going to necessarily release remains to a family until they've been paid, which is a crappy situation. But again, if you turn around and say we want all these things, we want this nice urn, and we want all these things taken care of, and it's like we got $6,000, and the funeral home goes to the expense, takes care of everything, and has it ready, and then you come in like, we only have 3. At that point, the funeral home has to make a real ethical decision of what they're actually going to do.
And that's where, when you get into Cantrell, you find out that this happened. I mean, first of all, in a very poor situation, just involving just the physical plant or building of Cantrell, but also a larger thing in Detroit, because Detroit is just one of those places that since the 1950s has just lost every toss of the coin. I mean, it's regularly rated among the top 50 or top 5 or 10 worst cities in America.
Most dangerous city.
Most dangerous city. The whole water contamination issue in Flint is played out as a horror. Exactly how not to manage a water district. Since 2017, it's been in the top 10% of the United States cities for violent crime. The median home value was about $42,800. That's bottom 10%. I mean, it's just one of the worst. It's the quintessential Rust Belt city. So it's not surprising that it happens in Detroit, really.
But when you start talking about the funeral industry, that's the one time when you're like, no, that's the one thing that we should not see. Vultures in taking advantage of the impoverished. Because, the talk about the one time when you should be definitely shown dignity and respect is in
upon death, particularly the death of a newborn or a stillborn. My God. Yeah, it's a horror. And this place, Cantrell in particular, this is a place where inspectors found peeling paint on the walls, tiles on floors that were breaking apart, a ventilation system that wasn't working. Now imagine how that must have smelled. Because formaldehyde's a bad enough smell as it is, but when one of the inspection report on Cantrell is about 55 pages long. Wow. The inspectors found things in 2017 like 2 embalmed bodies in caskets in a garage, open air garage, no refrigeration. 23 bodies throughout the facility, 4 in caskets at the funeral facility's chapel. So you're in there to bury Uncle Fred, say, and thank you everyone for coming today. We're here to honor the memory of Uncle Fred, and we might as well throw in the other 4 bodies that go along the floor. The other 4 caskets along the wall because they're here, and why not pay respect to them too? I mean, they had a casket they found in an embalming room. They had caskets, one casket in an unlocked hearse in warm temperatures, and none of the bodies was in a refrigerated facility. And
Nope.
then in 2018, this is after the city's on, this is after the state's onto these guys. There were, that's when the real horror story began, because that's when 11 uncremated human remains were found in attic and ceiling spaces.
Was that the one that was called in, like an anonymous tip? Someone had bought the building.
Yeah.
And was going to be converted over, and an anonymous
building.
tip came in and said, "Hey, yeah, by the way, go look in the attic," kind of thing. And it was
yeah, and also in 2018, as if all the stuff with the bodies wasn't bad enough, there were break-ins, 6 break-ins in all, where copper wiring and plumbing, TVs, a chainsaw, iPads, clothes, bathroom sinks all those things were stolen.
Yep.
Bathroom sinks were busted, water pipes were busted. You really just had this place getting plundered.
Yep. Well, because again, it looked abandoned, was abandoned. No one was there. So there was even actually one report of there was an open casket funeral. They had not done the embalming correctly, and while they're there, with your relative, you're doing maggots were actually coming out of facial orifices because it wasn't. So I mean, there's your horrific.
Yeah. I mean, they had, here's another one that there were bodily fluids left in buckets in a basement, and, bodies that were,
no concern.
I mean, just a nightmare, right.
It was how much money can we take in?
Right.
And where was that money? Where was that money going?
But I'll tell you, I mean, it just doesn't strike you as, like, to me, it sounds like a situation of just nightmare and dysfunction of a different sort, because if you're going to be smart about running a criminal enterprise, you're not going to make the area cleaner.
Where, whatever that the potential client is going to see is beautiful, gorgeous, down to the nines. But if you go at any point behind the facade and into the back scene, pull the curtain on the wizard, it's a crap show. I mean, so it wouldn't surprise you to find out, at Cantrell, whatever the client saw from the minute they crossed the door may have been threadbare and worn and may not have been the best, but it would have been clean. But the minute you got into a back hallway, the minute you got into a back area, the minute you got a back office, we know what it looked like. I mean, ceilings are falling in, peeling paint, tile being ripped out of the floor, gouges in the hallways. It's like no one cared, because it really was just an operation. And I think that's the most offensive thing about all of it. It was just about how much money can we get in. We're not going to put a dime back into the business. We're just going to take as much money as we can. Some of the other situations, Perry, Howell, Ramsey, struck me more as, because they were more cremated remains. And there you've got a split of 3 different things that can go on. The first is, I mean, I actually ended up with one of my clients. I ended up with cremated remains for one of my clients for quite some time until I could find a relative to take them. Because the choice of the funeral home is, they can essentially potter's field them. Every funeral home has a section of consecrated ground that they can inter remains, and then there's a marker, a code on it. So if someone does show up and say, "Hey, that's my relative," they know where to go find them. They monitor that. But there's a cost associated with renting that field, with interring, with removing. There's a cost. There's the medallion that goes on top of it. There's a cost. And if you are cost conscious, if you are immoral and unethical, and you don't want to spend the $300 or $400 to do it, then you're like, I can save $300 or $400. I could just take this. Box of remains is not that big. It's about the size of my head, honestly. That's it. That's all it is. So you're going to take that and just stack it somewhere. Just if someone to put it in the garage, I'm going to stick it in the attic. I'm going to do whatever with it. The other, so you legitimately could be left with remains on hand. The other side is that you could also you could be left remains on hand because there's no one to claim them. This is someone that unfortunately died impoverished and homeless. They deserve the respect of a proper cremation and burial, but they decide not to.
Just don't get it.
They could also be that same situation. And cremated remains are still unethical, but it's not as, I guess, which is you have a family that can't afford to pay you. So you're holding the cremated remains until they can come up with the money in order to pay off the funeral expenses. I could argue both sides of that. I personally believe that to be unethical. If you really, at that point, you can't work with them. Once the remains go, they're never going to give you another dime. I mean, that's just the reality of it. But
it's just a tragic situation because so many of the people who get into the funeral home business are they want to. I had a friend in high school who's been doing it really all his adult life. We knew each other when we were 15 and 16 years old. And John used to get teased a lot. You want to run a funeral? And I asked him once seriously, because he's a good man. I said, why do you want to do this? And he said, think about when you need the most help, when your family, your friends need the most help.
Yep.
And yeah, that's what motivates a lot of them. I have another friend who does this, who's done this for a living. He inherited the business from his father.
Okay.
And he used to go with his father as a young man. Whenever his father had to go pick up a body at a crime scene or do something like that, he would go with his father. And he started doing that himself. So you're seeing people not just, dead, but dead usually in the worst circumstances. And it does instill I know that it instilled in my friend Steve a real desire to see justice done and people taken care of appropriately, because there are a few things in life that are less dignified than a homicide scene. The vulnerability, the appalling vulnerability of a person who's been murdered is something that you just never you never get past. And I think that's one of the things that motivates people too, is there is genuinely in a lot of people who run funeral homes, a desire to see human dignity restored. And that's what makes this crime, this civil crime,
particularly well, there's some criminal elements to this as well, but this is I've been doing conserved work for 16 years. I've been for a long time. And I've been all over the state of Connecticut. So I've had clients that have either passed or lived in different areas. I have never, ever met a funeral director or a funeral home employee that I have a negative thing to say about. I have a ton of positive things to say about. Deeply respectful, very gracious, very friendly, never been treated in a rude manner. Now, I could go on a host of this list. Talk about a profession that is nothing but. It doesn't. any profession, you're going to find that there are bad eggs in it. There are people that get in it for whatever reason. I don't think you last long if you're particularly in this. But here we have stresses
right, and the stresses of the business are enormous too.
Was Cantrell? Correct me if I'm wrong, but Cantrell was started by the dad, and the dad passed at 97. Right. And this is one of those situations where I have a feeling, I don't know, but Mr. Cantrell took it like he was that guy that took it seriously.
He was the business. Right.
His kids got involved. It may have been over their head. It may have been, whatever it might have been. You're in an impoverished community. This is the other side to it, actually. So a couple funeral homes that I deal with are very nice Connecticut suburbs. So you can have funerals that are going for $40,000-$50,000, nice caskets, everything else, and the funeral home should make money. Period. They're not going to exist if they're not making money. I am never going to begrudge a funeral home for making money. You know what? The more money they make, God bless them. The better off that I think everyone's going to be. But not every funeral home is going to be located in a nice area. And quite frankly, when you're dealing with funeral homes that are located in inner city, Hartford, Bridgeport, which I've had to deal with, I shouldn't say had to, which I've dealt with. They, again, just as gracious, but you're not getting a $40,000 funeral out in there. They're not making as much. So things are a little more threadbare. Things are a little more direct. Again, not a negative thing. I don't think there's any difference in treatment of remains. But I think you're ending up in that situation where you're in Detroit. It's an impoverished community. These businesses are making money based off, quite frankly, either Medicaid Title 19 spend round funeral contracts, or they're making money from the state for handling remains. And, no one's getting rich off state contracts or state money, because it's whatever the minimum they can pay is what they're going to pay. And so the family might well have said, look, we can't survive on, Dad was able to survive on this. There's X number of us, we can't survive on this. And no one really took control and said, this is our passion and what we want to do.
Yeah. And it became because they got an anonymous letter, and also with Perry, there was a lawsuit filed.
Because of the infant.
27, the infant who had been alive for 27 minutes. So I think whenever you get a lawsuit filed, that's when you really start seeing the legal community, lawyers, attorneys, judges, whatever, starting to get stirred up by something. and you're talking about like in some of what you said came out with what happened with Perry, at least according. I mean, the Detroit News did a lot of good reporting on this, and
They
one of the
did.
things that they said was that there was Perry had gotten possession of bodies, dead human bodies, of the fetuses and infants without first even getting directed or authorized to do so by a relative, which to me goes back to that point that where you in your career experience having to hang on to somebody for a while because you can't find permission.
Well,
I mean,
it's
there's
not
a lot of
permission. It's so
permission or someone to give you authorization.
right.
And the thing that really gets me with this is I think some of this, is going to create some of this is red tape exhaustion. People have these, what do you do with these bodies if there's nobody here to claim them?
So
you're talking about an atmosphere of extreme, of possibly extreme social malaise or disorder,
So here's what happens when someone passes. And it's difficult, particularly as a conservator, because the funeral home looks at you as a conservator and says you are the only human being that is taking care of this individual. And when this individual passes, the conservatorship is terminated because it only applies to the living. So now you've got a situation where someone has passed. The funeral home has to take possession of the remains because it's got to go somewhere.
Right.
But there is there is actual documentation for permission to take possession of the remains. If it's not done immediately, if there's no human being to do it, the funeral home has to, on its own expense, go to court and ask for permission to take possession. So what they try to do, and sometimes I'll agree, sometimes I won't, depends on the situation, is they will ask me to pre-sign that document while the person is still alive, and I, as the conservator, have the authority to do it. And I have the authority to do it, but what will end up happening a lot of times is if I know there's a relative, if I know there's a living relative, I won't do it. Because what I don't want to have happen is that living relative to come in and say, why didn't you give me that option? So at the end of the day, sometimes a living relative won't come forward. I do have a horror story about that actually was a lawsuit. And that is, there was a conservative individual, and the conservative did the exact same thing. Wouldn't sign the paperwork. Says, I'm not doing it, I'm not doing it, I'm not doing it. We know there's living relatives out there. And there's a daughter specifically. And so when it came time for possession of the remains, they tried contacting the daughter. They knew where she was. She wasn't responding. I'm not kidding. I'm dead serious. It is 6 months before they finally went to court, and they said we cannot locate her. We cannot locate the daughter. Court reappointed the conservator specifically for this. They signed all the paperwork and got it done. At that point, it's cremation because you don't have. Wow! Again, when you do this all the time, it's like it's just kind of you're used to it.
It becomes normal.
For those of you who have never had to deal with the death in a family, first of all, God bless you. You're fortunate. So here's what happens. The process is this. Someone passes, funeral home takes possession. They need someone to sign off to take possession of the remains, so they sign off. You have to make a decision. Is it going to be an interment, whole, or are you going to cremate? What are you going to do with the remains? Also, are you going to have a celebration? Or are you going to, what do you need? And there's going to be a cost associated with everything. Believe it or not, individually, it's not very expensive. Like renting cars for a funeral is like $200. It's actually not. It's $200 for the cars, which is not necessarily expensive, and then you get, $150 for the chapel, and then you get a priest or someone. And, eventually that's what adds up to the cost. And the casket or the urn that's pretty much a substantial cost. That's really where the funeral home actually makes its money on casket sales and urn sales. So if you turn around and say no urn, no casket, I have never, ever, ever heard of a funeral home getting upset or trying to talk someone into something. I'm sure it's probably happened, but the funeral homes I deal with are just like, whatever you would like, if that's what you would like, that's fine.
Right. It's a real graciousness that you need.
It is. It's without question.
Real graciousness you need
right.
to do that work effectively.
Without question. So you turn around and you sign off, take possession of remains, which basically gives the funeral home permission to what they're going to do with the body. So they can inter. Now again, interment. Now the funeral homes don't deal with graveyards. You have to have that pre-done. You have to have a graveyard identified, you have to have the gravesite identified, and then there's a cost for opening the grave, there's a cost for interment, there's a cost for closing. That is separate from the funeral cost. And some people don't understand that when you get the funeral contract, you get everything taken care of. They think that includes an interment, and it does not. So you have to make sure that that is taken care of, and the same thing with ashes. Now, the thing with ashes that absolutely is 100% allowed and legal, once the ashes are released to you, you can do whatever you want with the ashes. You want to turn around and do a big Lebowski and take them out to a big cliff right up there? No, I mean, really, you can. They're your ashes because they are sanitized, and they're not medical waste. They're just ash. Right. So again, culturally in our society. So again, I compared suburban and urban funeral homes before, and there's more money in suburban than urban. I will tell you that there is no difference at all in the family expectation of the way that their loved one's going to be treated or taken care of. Exactly, and there's no difference in their desire to make sure that their loved one is cared for or treated appropriately. I suspect in a lot of these cases that these were abandoned people that didn't necessarily have family who were pursuing and coming up and to take care of them. So you have this situation where it's like,
it's sad.
How do you get here?
It's sad, and it's right.
Why Detroit?
It's sad and pathetic.
Yeah. And I think you hit the nail on the head with the, again, Detroit is just this insanely impoverished area.
Right.
And when you're going to get those people who are looking to take advantage of the poor, you're going to get, in every industry, and you're going to end up in this situation too.
The bigger the city, sometimes the more extreme the reality.
Yeah.
The more extreme the crime.
Well,
and I think that's where we can talk about how this goes next. I think what you're going to see is it's the catch-22 that local, state, federal government is always into. You have this extreme situation. Legislators' first response is, oh my God, how do we prevent this? Right. And the way you prevent it is by tightening up the procedures,
right,
by increasing the oversight of how these things are done, increasing the paperwork.
Yep.
And now you have a spiral that begins with squeezing people who are in business to do more paperwork, to have to handle more red tape, to withstand more oversight, more inspections.
Yep.
And then eventually the cost gets passed along to the consumer. And that's where you start seeing real red tape exhaustion. It's a problem that can perpetuate itself because businesses that did fine, that were always conscientious, end up having to pay for those that don't.
Well, and what's interesting is, again, the funeral homes I'm used to dealing with are not employee deep. Funeral directors do a lot of the work. That's the reality of being a funeral director. It's not an office job where you sit there and talk to families and come in, you do some social work and work with them and send them away. You do body preparation. You do the funerals themselves. You are the one that drives the vehicle. You are the one that, this is not it's not an 8-hour day in any way, shape, or form.
Oh, it's a life commitment.
Oh yeah, really but you don't have a staff that's there. That's the one in particular, or the two in particular I think of. It's like there is one essential secretarial position that does paperwork and answers phones and does that one. So if you turn around and pile a bunch more paperwork and everything else, they're going to have someone that can do it, or they have to hire another person to start handling it because there's only so many hours in a day you can work.
And what you're also going to see too, I think, is you're going to see if this happens again, if there's a big bunch, if there's like 4 or 5 or a half dozen funeral homes in another locale, Los Angeles, wherever, pretty soon you're going to start seeing media newspapers read newspapers, television watches television, radio listens to radio. And you're going to see more media start saying, hey, is this happening here? And what do we do about it?